On the afternoon of September 11th, 1902, a patrolman named William Burns stood at the corner of 23rd Street and 5th Avenue, blowing his whistle until his lungs ached. He was not stopping a crime. He was dispersing a crowd of 200 men who had gathered, shoulder to shoulder, eyes fixed upward. They were not watching the triangular tower rising 22 stories above them. They were waiting for the wind. Within days of the Flatiron Building's completion, the structure had created something its architect never intended: a wind tunnel that lifted women's skirts 6 feet into the air. And the men of New York noticed. Chapter 1. The Lot That Nobody Wanted. For 37 years, the triangular wedge where Broadway slashed through 5th Avenue sat empty, a geometric insult no developer would touch. The mathematics were brutal. 6,700 square feet of Manhattan real estate, tapering from 190 feet at its northern base to a sharp point just 6 feet wide at its southern tip. Any structure built on such a wedge would hemorrhage usable space with every floor, leaving corridors that narrowed to nothing and offices shaped like slices of pie cut by a drunk. The lot sat at the intersection of 3 of the city's most valuable thoroughfares, yet it remained a void, a blank space on property maps where ambition went to die. Surveyors kept returning to measure it. They arrived with their chains and transits, hoping somehow the angles might have shifted, that the iron laws of geometry might show mercy. They never did. Broadway crossed 5th Avenue at exactly 23 degrees, creating a wedge so acute that architects dismissed it without calculation. To build here was to fight mathematics itself. The land had value only as absence. Pedestrians used it as a shortcut. Street vendors stationed themselves at its edges, knowing foot traffic converged here, whether anyone wanted it to or not. On summer evenings, the open space caught breezes that offered momentary relief from the Manhattan heat. The city had accidentally created a plaza by virtue of economic impossibility. Property records from 1865 through 1900 show the same pattern. Ownership changed hands regularly, always at prices far below comparable plots nearby. Each new owner arrived convinced they could solve the puzzle. Each departed having learned the same lesson. You cannot negotiate with triangles. The few preliminary designs that emerged during those decades reveal the scope of the problem. One 1892 proposal suggested building only on the northern third of the lot, leaving the tapered southern section as a narrow courtyard. Another recommended constructing separate structures at each corner, connected by glass corridors. A third simply drew a rectangular building that ignored the lot lines entirely, floating in space on the blueprint like an architect's admission of defeat. The wedge became a kind of professional dare among New York's building elite. Can you solve it? Can you make this work? The answer, for 37 years, remained no. The lot wanted to be empty. It insisted on it. And the city, pragmatic and ruthless, had learned to accept what geometry demanded. But in 1897, the Newhouse brothers purchased the parcel for $800,000. They were architects, not developers. They had no immediate plans. They simply believed that any plot in Manhattan would eventually find its purpose. They stored the deed in a safe and waited for someone mad enough or visionary enough to see what they could not. That man arrived 4 years later, and he did not see the lot the way others did. He saw it exactly as it was: impossible, visible, and unforgettable. Chapter 2. The Man Who Saw Corners Differently. Harry Black made his first fortune selling buildings no one lived in yet, convincing investors to gamble on blueprints and dirt. He was born in 1868 in Ontario, the son of a farmer who lost everything in a single bad harvest. Black watched his father become smaller after that, watched confidence drain from a man who had believed land would provide. The lesson Black learned was not about land, it was about belief. His father had trusted dirt, Black would trust vision. By 1895, Black had moved to Chicago and attached himself to the Fuller Company, a construction firm that had pioneered steel frame skyscraper techniques. He did not build, he sold. More precisely, he sold futures. Black would secure a plot, commission preliminary designs, then sell shares in a building that existed only as ink on paper. He convinced investors they were buying not structure, but position, not floors, but advantage. His gift was making the unbuilt seem inevitable. The Fuller Company grew wealthy during the Chicago building boom, and Black rose with it. When the company decided to expand eastward, Black volunteered to lead the New York operations. He arrived in Manhattan in 1900 with $700,000 in capital and an instinct for spectacle. New York was adding skyscrapers faster than it could count them, but Black understood that height alone no longer guaranteed attention. The city needed novelty. It needed provocation. When the Newhouse brothers approached him about the triangular lot, Black did not see a problem. He saw a monument to his own philosophy, that the buildings no one else would touch became the buildings no one could forget. The lot's very impossibility made it valuable. A conventional rectangular tower would disappear into the Manhattan grid. A triangular tower would define an intersection, dominate a corner, become the single fixed point in a sea of architectural sameness. Black commissioned Daniel Burnham to design it. Burnham was Chicago's most celebrated architect, the man who had shaped the world's Columbian Exposition and established the City Beautiful movement. He believed buildings should express civic grandeur, not merely function. More importantly, he had mastered the steel skeleton technique that made tall, narrow structures viable. If anyone could make a triangular skyscraper stand, it was Burnham. The partnership had perfect symmetry. Black provided the audacity. Burnham provided the credibility. Together, they would build something that should not exist, and they would make the city accept it simply by refusing any alternative. Black understood that the building would be hated. He counted on it. Hatred required attention. Controversy required discussion. And discussion created value. When critics called the project madness, Black smiled and raised more capital. When engineers predicted collapse, Black commissioned additional structural analyses and published them in newspapers. Every prediction of failure became free advertising for a building that promised to fail spectacularly or succeed impossibly. Either outcome would be unforgettable. His investors were not buying floors. They were buying the certainty that this building would never be ignored. In March 1901, construction began. Black stood at the corner and watched the first steel beams arrive. They would anchor them to bedrock 65 feet below the street, then build upward 22 stories, defying every assumption about what narrow land could support. The building would taper to a point so sharp that the top floor offices would be barely wider than the desks inside them. It was magnificent, it was absurd, and it was entirely his. Chapter 3: Steel Against Gravity's Certainty. Daniel Burnham's design required 15,000 tons of steel to stand on a foundation no wider than a hallway, and every engineer in the city predicted collapse. The doubts began before the first beam rose. Structural engineers published calculations in trade journals showing that a building this narrow and this tall would sway dangerously in wind. The steel frame would flex, the facade would crack, and in a moderate storm, the entire structure would shear from its foundation and topple southward into Madison Square Park, killing hundreds. Burnham's response was not to argue. It was to build better. He designed a steel skeleton so dense and interconnected that the building functioned not as a collection of floors stacked vertically, but as a single rigid unit. 15,000 tons of steel formed a lattice where every beam supported every other beam. The structure had no weak points because it had no independence. Each element existed only in relation to the whole. The foundation extended 65 feet into Manhattan bedrock, anchored by caissons sunk through layers of fill and clay until they struck solid stone. Workers descended into those shafts each morning, digging in compressed air chambers where the pressure made their ears bleed and their heads pound. 3 men died during foundation work, crushed when a caisson wall collapsed. Their names appeared in the next day's newspaper, then vanished from the public record. But the building continued rising. New Yorkers gathered daily to watch. This was not admiration. This was morbid curiosity. Betting pools formed in taverns around Madison Square, with odds posted on when the structure would fail. Some bet on specific dates. Others wagered on weather conditions. A windstorm in October 1901, when the building stood only 11 stories tall, drew crowds of thousands who arrived expecting to witness disaster. The building shuddered. The steel groaned audibly. Then it stood firm, and the crowds dispersed, disappointed. Newspapers published weekly updates, often illustrated with diagrams showing theoretical failure modes. The New York Times called it an engineering folly. The Tribune questioned whether the Fuller Company had secured adequate insurance. The Sun published an interview with a prominent architect who refused to be named, but insisted the building would not survive its first winter. Burnham ignored them all. He arrived at the site each morning at 6, walked the incomplete floors, checked every connection point, and departed at dusk. He was 65 years old, his health declining, and he treated this building as though it might be his final statement. It would stand because he could not allow any other outcome. The construction spectacle reached its peak in June 1902, when workers installed the final beam on the 22nd floor. A crowd of over 5,000 gathered below. Some came to witness completion. Most came hoping for catastrophe. A brass band played. Flags flew from temporary masts. Workers raised the beam slowly, into the crowd watching in silence as steel met steel 307 feet above the street. The beam connected. The building was complete. And in that moment, the betting pools closed. The doubters did not apologize. They simply recalculated. Perhaps the building would stand in calm weather but fail in wind. Perhaps it would survive 1 year but not 10. Perhaps the steel would fatigue, the foundations would settle, the facade would crack. The Flatiron Building did not care about perhaps. It cared about standing. And on September 6, 1902, it opened for business, a geometric impossibility made real, as newspapers called it both a marvel and an abomination. The first tenants moved in. The Fuller Company occupied the top floors. Publishers and investment firms leased offices on the middle levels. Retail shops filled the ground floor, their display windows curving to match the building's acute angles. Everything functioned exactly as designed. But within 72 hours, the building revealed what Burnham had not anticipated. The structure stood perfectly. The consequences did not. Chapter 4. When the wind found its weapon. Within 72 hours of the building's completion, the first woman felt her skirt rise, and the first crowd of men began to gather. The physics were invisible, but absolute. The Flatiron's triangular profile created a vertical obstruction at the intersection of two wind corridors. Prevailing winds from the Hudson River moved eastward along 23rd Street. Crosswinds from the north traveled down Fifth Avenue. When these currents encountered the building's narrow leading edge, they had nowhere to go but up and down. The updrafts were extraordinary. On the building's northern face, where Fifth Avenue met 23rd Street, wind speeds regularly reached 40 miles per hour on days when the rest of Manhattan felt only a gentle breeze. The gusts came in pulses, created by the building's interruption of natural airflow, and they concentrated at pedestrian level with surgical precision. Women wearing the long skirts fashionable in 1902 found themselves suddenly exposed. The wind lifted fabric to knee height, waist height, sometimes higher. There was no warning, no gust of dust or swirling leaves to signal what was coming. Just sudden, violent uplift that turned a simple walk down Fifth Avenue into public humiliation. The first recorded incident appeared in police logs on September 1902. A woman crossing at 23rd Street was struck by a gust so powerful it lifted her skirt over her head. She fell, striking her knee on the pavement. Witnesses helped her to her feet while a small crowd laughed. She filed no complaint. She simply left, walking east to avoid returning past the building. By September 11th, crowds had begun to gather. 24 men stationed themselves at the corner, waiting. When a woman approached, they watched. When the wind struck, they applauded. Police patrolman William Burns arrived mid-afternoon to find over 200 men blocking the sidewalk, their attention fixed upward, their eyes tracking every woman who passed. Burns blew his whistle. He shouted. He physically pushed men away from the corner. They dispersed briefly, then returned. This was not a crowd with a destination. This was a crowd with a purpose. The building had created a reliable spectacle, and spectacle attracts an audience. Within a week, the New York Police Department had coined a term for the corner, 23 skidoo. The phrase meant to leave quickly, to get lost, to move along. Officers shouted it dozens of times daily as they attempted to disperse the men who arrived each afternoon like clockwork. The phrase entered common usage almost immediately, spreading through the city as shorthand for forced departure. But at its origin was something darker, a building that had weaponized wind and men who gathered to watch women be humiliated. The Fuller Company remained silent. Harry Black, when asked by reporters about the wind issue, they stated that the building functioned exactly as designed and that he could not be held responsible for natural weather patterns. Daniel Burnham, reached by telegram in Chicago, replied that the structure's aerodynamics were sound and that public behavior was not an architectural concern. No one took responsibility because responsibility would have required acknowledging that a building could create social harm. Architecture was steel and stone, floor plans and elevations. It was not supposed to generate controversy by existing. Yet here was a structure that transformed a public street into a predatory space simply by standing where it stood. Women began altering their routes. Department stores on Fifth Avenue reported decreased foot traffic. The Madison Square Theater noted fewer female patrons at matinee performances. His letters to newspaper editors described the corner as shameful, degrading, and dangerous. One writer noted that women could no longer walk Manhattan's most prestigious avenue without planning their path around a single building. But planning routes required knowing the danger existed. Visitors to the city, women unfamiliar with the Flatiron's reputation, walked into the wind tunnel unprepared. They became unwitting participants in a spectacle they never consented to join. By October 1902, the daily crowds numbered in the hundreds. Men brought opera glasses. They brought cameras. They positioned themselves in doorways and against walls, creating human corridors that funneled women toward the exact spot where the updrafts were strongest. It became a coordinated observation post, a predatory machine that ran on architecture and opportunity. The police could not stop it. Loitering was not illegal. Looking upward was not a crime. And the building itself committed no violation. It simply stood, generating consequences its creators had never imagined and would never fully reckon with. The Flatiron Building had solved an impossible engineering problem, but in doing so, it had created an impossible social one, and that problem would define the building's first decade as much as its revolutionary design. Chapter 5. The Battle for 23rd Street. By November of 1902, the New York Police Department had assigned 4 officers to full-time crowd dispersal at the Flatiron's base. The assignment rotated weekly. No officer wanted it permanently. The duty required standing at a corner for 8 hours, watching men watch women, shouting the same phrase hundreds of times until your voice went hoarse. 23, skidoo, move along, skidoo. The phrase lost meaning through repetition, becoming just sound, just noise in a city that already had too much of both. Police logs from late 1902 reveal the scope of the problem. On November 3rd, Officer Patrick Hennessy recorded dispersing crowds 47 times during his shift. On November 9th, Officer James Walsh noted that the same group of approximately 30 men returned after each dispersal, repositioning themselves in new locations around the intersection. On November 17th, Officer Thomas Riley reported that men were now arriving with folding chairs. The chairs were the breaking point. They represented permanence, intention. These were not men pausing during a walk. These were men who had planned to spend hours at the corner, who treated the wind tunnel as entertainment worthy of leisure time and furniture. The police began confiscating chairs. They cited men for obstruction. They threatened arrests for disorderly conduct. None of it worked. Convicting someone for watching a street required proving criminal intent, and judges consistently ruled that observation alone did not constitute a crime. The men were not touching anyone. They were not shouting obscenities. They were simply looking, and looking, the courts determined, was protected behavior. Women's accounts from this period are harder to find. Newspapers rarely printed them. The few that survive appear in letters to editors, often unsigned. One woman described changing her work schedule to avoid passing the Flatiron during lunch hours. Another noted that she had begun wearing multiple layers of petticoats, adding weight to her skirts to resist the wind. A third wrote that she no longer felt safe walking alone in that part of the city, not because of the wind, but because of the men who waited for it. The New York Society for the Suppression of Vice attempted to intervene. Founded by Anthony Comstock to combat obscenity and public indecency, the organization argued that the Flatiron Corner had become a site of organized voyeurism. Comstock himself visited the location in December 1902 and declared it morally corrupting. He demanded the Fuller Company install windscreens or architectural modifications to eliminate the updrafts. Harry Black refused. In a statement to the New York Tribune, he argued that no property owner could be held liable for wind. He suggested that if women found the corner uncomfortable, they should choose different routes. The responsibility, he insisted, belonged to individuals, not architecture. The statement enraged women's advocacy groups. The National American Woman Suffrage Association condemned Black publicly, noting that his position effectively banned women from public space to solve a problem created by men. The Women's Municipal League organized a protest march past the Flatiron in January 1903, with over 300 participants walking deliberately through the wind tunnel, while male onlookers jeered and police struggled to maintain order. The march changed nothing. The crowds continued, the police continued dispersing them, and the building continued standing, indifferent to the conflict it had generated. Some men who gathered at the corner attempted to justify their presence. Interviews published in sensational newspapers quoted several who claimed they were studying architecture, observing engineering, or simply enjoying the building's unique beauty. One man told a reporter he found the wind patterns fascinating from a scientific perspective. Another insisted he was there to ensure women's safety, as though his presence somehow protected rather than threatened. These justifications convinced no one. The pattern was too consistent, too obviously coordinated. On windy days, the crowd swelled to over 400. On calm days, they dwindled, but never disappeared entirely. Someone was always waiting. The Flatiron had become a landmark not for what it was, but for what it enabled. Business owners near the intersection began complaining about lost trade. A restaurant on the building's ground floor reported that female customers stopped coming. A florist on Fifth Avenue noted that women crossed to the opposite side of the street rather than walk past his shop. The economic impact rippled outward from the corner, affecting establishments that had no connection to the building itself. The Fuller Company received dozens of letters demanding action. Most went unanswered. A few received brief replies stating that the company had no legal obligation to modify natural wind patterns. One letter writer suggested building glass barriers at street level. Another proposed installing weighted chains along the building's northern face to disrupt airflow. A third recommended criminal prosecution of any man caught loitering at the corner. None of these proposals were implemented. The building stood as designed, and every afternoon the ritual repeated. Women approached, wind struck, men watched, police dispersed. Everyone understood their role in a performance no one had auditioned for. By spring of 1903, the situation had calcified. The Flatiron corner was simply accepted as a problem without solution, a flaw in the city's fabric that New York had learned to navigate around. Guidebooks began noting the wind tunnel, advising women to avoid the intersection or approach it carefully. Tour operators steered groups away from 23rd Street during windy weather. The building had created a dead zone in Manhattan's pedestrian geography, a place where half the population could not move freely. And the architects, engineers, and developers who had created that zone felt no obligation to fix what they had broken. The question was never whether the wind would stop. The question was who would be held accountable for what the wind revealed. And the answer, consistently, was no one. Chapter 6. The building critics refused to love. While crowds gathered below for spectacle, architecture critics above waged their own war, calling the Flatiron a monstrous interruption of civic beauty. The aesthetic attacks began even before construction finished. Montgomery Schuyler, the most respected architecture critic in New York, I wrote an architectural record that the building represented everything wrong with American commercial architecture: height without grace, visibility without beauty, innovation without tradition. He called it a stingy piece of pie that insulted the elegant Beaux Arts buildings surrounding Madison Square. The criticism was not merely aesthetic, it was philosophical. The Flatiron represented the Chicago school's engineering first approach, where form followed function and decoration served no purpose beyond surface appeal. This violated every principle of the Beaux Arts movement that dominated New York's architectural establishment. Buildings were supposed to express civic ideals through classical proportions, ornamental detail, and historical reference. The Flatiron did none of these things. It simply stood, efficient and tall, owing nothing to architectural history. Critics mocked its limestone and terracotta facade as costume jewelry on an iron skeleton. They derided its Renaissance revival ornamentation as borrowed credibility, an attempt to disguise brutal functionality with borrowed sophistication. The building's narrow leading edge, its most distinctive feature, was labeled grotesque, a deformity that violated the rectangular harmony of Manhattan's grid. The New York Times architecture columnist wrote that the building looked like a ship's prow sailing into Madison Square, but not a beautiful ship, a cargo vessel, something built for utility, not elegance. Harper's Weekly published an illustration showing the Flatiron as a massive clothes iron pressing down on the neighborhood, flattening beauty and proportion beneath its industrial weight. But the harshest criticism focused on what the building represented: the complete victory of commerce over culture. The Flatiron contained offices, nothing more. It had no grand lobby suitable for civic gathering. It housed no museum, library, or public hall. It was real estate, pure and simple, designed to extract maximum rent from minimum land. Every floor existed only to generate income. Every design decision served profit. The building was capitalism made vertical, and critics who believed architecture should serve higher purposes than quarterly returns found it morally offensive. Daniel Burnham attempted to defend his design in a letter to Architectural Record, arguing that the building's triangular form was an honest response to its triangular site. That beauty emerged from solving problems well rather than decorating them elaborately. His argument convinced almost no one. Critics accused him of abandoning the city beautiful principles he had championed in Chicago, of sacrificing ideals for a paycheck from Harry Black's Fuller Company. The battle lines were clear. Traditionalists believed Manhattan's skyline should express cultural aspiration through classical forms. Modernists believed it should express commercial reality through structural honesty. The Flatiron became the battlefield where these philosophies clashed most visibly. But while critics debated aesthetics in journals, the building faced a more practical problem. It could not find enough tenants. By March 1903, 6 months after opening, the upper floors remained largely empty. Companies hesitated to lease space in a building so publicly despised, in a structure that might collapse, in offices shaped like geometric puzzles. The Fuller Company occupied floors 18 through 21, using them for its own operations. Publishers leased several mid-level floors, attracted by cheap rents. But the most desirable spaces, the top floors with commanding views of Manhattan, sat vacant. Harry Black slashed prices. He offered multi-year leases at below-market rates. He promised free renovations to customize floor plans. Nothing worked. The building's notoriety had made it commercially radioactive. Ground floor retail faced similar struggles. Shops in the curved facade section reported that customers found the angled walls disorienting, and display windows that wrapped around the building's point created awkward sightlines, and the wind tunnel issue drove away female shoppers entirely, eliminating half the retail customer base. By summer 1903, the Flatiron had become what its critics always predicted, a financial failure dressed in architectural hubris. It stood tall and hated, generating controversy but not profit, famous but not loved. The building had won the engineering argument. It had proven that steel could support 22 stories on a triangular base. But it had lost every other battle that mattered. Architectural journals stopped covering it. The novelty had passed. New skyscrapers were rising throughout Manhattan, taller and more conventional than the Flatiron, and critics turned their attention to projects that deserved analysis rather than derision. The building was dismissed as a curiosity, a mistake that would be forgotten as soon as larger structures eclipsed it. Real estate analysts predicted the Flatiron would be demolished within a decade. The land was too valuable to waste on a failed experiment. A new owner would eventually purchase the property, tear down Burnham's folly, and replace it with something profitable and proportional. The building's fate seemed certain. It would survive just long enough to be replaced by something better. But fate had not consulted the photographers. Chapter 7. When cameras made it permanent. In 1904, a photographer named Edward Steichen climbed to a rooftop at dusk and turned the city's most hated building into art. Steichen positioned his camera on Madison Square, aimed north toward the Flatiron's narrow leading edge, and waited. The building at midday was everything critics claimed: harsh, angular, aggressively utilitarian. But at dusk, in fading light, something shifted. The limestone facade softened. The sharp edges blurred. The structure became less building and more apparition, a geometric ghost floating above the darkening park. Steichen exposed the plate for several minutes, long enough that moving pedestrians vanished entirely, leaving only the building and the trees and the gas lamps glowing in the foreground. He titled the image "The Flatiron" and exhibited it at the little galleries of the Photo Secession in 1905. Critics who had spent 3 years condemning the building as ugly saw the photograph and reconsidered. The image worked because Steichen understood what architectural critics did not. The Flatiron's power emerged not from its details, but from its silhouette. The building's triangular form created a visual anchor, a fixed point that organized everything around it. In Steichen's photograph, the Flatiron did not dominate. It presided, calm and inevitable, as though it had always stood there and always would. Other photographers followed. Alfred Stieglitz captured the building through falling snow, turning its rigid geometry into something dreamlike. Alvin Langdon Coburn photographed it at dawn, when low light raked across the facade and created dramatic shadows that emphasized its vertical thrust. Each image found beauty not in ornament, but in form, not in decoration, but in presence. The photographs created a problem for the critics. You could argue that a building was ugly when standing in front of it, squinting at architectural details and measuring proportions. But you could not argue that Steichen's image was ugly. The photograph was undeniably beautiful. And if the photograph was beautiful, then perhaps the building itself possessed qualities that aesthetic theory had failed to recognize. The shift began slowly. Articles in photography journals praised the Flatiron as an ideal subject for modern image making. Its clean lines photographed better than ornate Beaux Arts structures, which became cluttered and illegible when reduced to 2 dimensions. The building's simplicity translated perfectly to film, creating compositions that balanced mass and void, light and shadow, presence and absence. By 1906, the Flatiron had become the most photographed building in New York. Postcard manufacturers printed thousands of images showing the structure from every angle, in every season, under every lighting condition. Tourists who had never visited Manhattan recognized the building instantly. It became shorthand for the city itself, an icon whose meaning transcended its physical reality. The cultural transformation was profound. The building that architects had dismissed as an insult to civic beauty became the single image most associated with urban modernity. Painters began including it in cityscapes. Illustrators used its distinctive profile to establish location in magazines and advertisements. The Flatiron stopped being a building and became a symbol, a visual metaphor for New York's vertical ambition. But symbols require distance. The photographers who made the Flatiron beautiful did so by positioning their cameras blocks away, by capturing the structure at dawn or dusk when crowds were absent, by eliminating from their frames everything that happened at street level. The photographs showed the building. They did not show what the building did. Steichen's famous image contained no women whose skirts were lifted. Stieglitz's snow scene included no men gathering to watch. The postcards featured no police officers shouting, "23 skidoo." The photographs created a version of the Flatiron that existed only as image, divorced entirely from the lived experience of the building's ground floor. And this divergence created something new, a building with two realities. Above, on film and in memory, the Flatiron was beautiful, iconic, worthy of preservation. Below, on the streets, it remained controversial, predatory, impossible to reconcile with its own reputation. The photographers had not redeemed the building. They had simply made it famous enough that redemption no longer mattered. Fame is a kind of immunity. Once something becomes iconic, criticism bounces off it. You cannot tear down a landmark even if the landmark causes harm, because the landmark has become larger than its physical form. It exists in collective memory, in shared imagery, in the cultural archive. And that version, the photographed version, feels more real than the version you can touch. By 1907, architectural critics had stopped calling for the Flatiron's demolition. Some even began praising aspects of Burnham's design, noting that the building had pioneered techniques now standard in skyscraper construction. The aesthetic consensus shifted from rejection to acceptance, not because the building had changed, but because the culture around it had. The Flatiron had won by becoming unavoidable. It appeared in so many photographs, postcards, paintings, and illustrations that New York without the Flatiron became unimaginable. The building had colonized the city's visual identity, and once that happened, its survival was assured. But survival and justice are different things. The building stood. The crowds still gathered, and the photographs hung in galleries, beautiful and silent, showing a version of the Flatiron that had never fully existed. Chapter 8: The Wind That Would Not Stop. Even as artists celebrated the building above, the wind continued its work below, and the crowds never fully dispersed for another decade. Police records from 1908 through 1918 show that the 23rd Street corner remained a chronic problem. Monthly reports document hundreds of dispersal actions annually. The language in these reports is resigned, bureaucratic, exhausted. Officers no longer described specific incidents. They simply noted crowd formations and responses, as though logging weather patterns or tidal movements. The persistence revealed something essential. The wind tunnel was not a temporary scandal. It was a permanent feature. The building could not be modified without demolition. The wind could not be stopped without eliminating the structure that created it. And elimination was no longer possible because the building had become too famous to destroy. Women continued altering their routes through 1915. Department store maps from the period show alternate pathways around Madison Square, with dotted lines indicating suggested routes for female shoppers. These maps were distributed discreetly, never advertised, never mentioned in store publications. Their existence acknowledged what the Fuller Company refused to, that the building had made part of Manhattan unsafe for half its population. Some women fought back. In 1911, a group of suffragists organized regular marches through the wind tunnel, deliberately provoking the gusts while male volunteers photographed the crowds of watching men. The photographs were used in advocacy materials arguing for stronger public decency laws. The campaign generated newspaper coverage but no legislative action. Watching remained legal. The building remained unchanged. The crowds evolved. By 1912, the daily gatherers were no longer primarily working men on lunch breaks. They were tourists, visitors who had read about the famous wind tunnel and wanted to witness it themselves. The phenomenon had become a destination, listed in guidebooks alongside museums and monuments. People traveled to 23rd Street specifically to see women's skirts lifted, and they saw nothing wrong with this because the building had made it normal. Normalization is insidious. What begins as scandal becomes curiosity, becomes tradition, becomes simply the way things are. The Flatiron Corner had transitioned through all these stages. By 1915, young men in New York casually invited dates to walk past the building, treating it as entertainment, an amusing quirk of urban life. The women who objected were labeled prudish or humorless. The building's fame had granted it immunity from moral scrutiny. Harry Black never acknowledged the problem. In interviews throughout the 1910s, he discussed the Flatiron's commercial success, its place in New York's skyline, its appearance in photographs and paintings. He never mentioned the wind. When reporters pressed him, he deflected, noting that thousands of people walked past the building daily without incident. This was technically true. It was also irrelevant. Daniel Burnham died in 1912, his legacy secured by dozens of landmark buildings across America. Obituaries praised his vision and his role in establishing modern urban planning. The Flatiron was mentioned in every tribute, always as a triumph, never as a complication. Yet Burnham never publicly addressed the wind tunnel issue. Perhaps he believed architecture ended at the building's skin, that what happened on sidewalks was not his concern. Or perhaps he simply chose silence over accountability. The building itself seemed indifferent to the controversy it generated. The steel stood firm. The facade weathered gracefully. Office tenants came and went, their leases unaffected by street-level chaos. The Flatiron functioned exactly as designed, fulfilling every structural requirement while ignoring every social consequence. This duality defines the building's second decade. Publicly, it was celebrated. Privately, it was endured. The gap between reputation and reality widened year by year, until they became entirely separate things. You could love the Flatiron in photographs while hating it in person, and you could admire its engineering while despising what that engineering enabled. These contradictions never resolved. They simply coexisted, awkward and unacknowledged. By 1917, the wind tunnel had claimed a permanent place in New York folklore. The phrase 23 skidoo had spread nationally, appearing in vaudeville routines and popular songs, always as humor, never as critique. The building's dark origin story had been polished into entertainment, its edges softened, its victims erased. And then in March 1918, nature provided the test that would finally settle one question, even as it left all others unresolved. Chapter 9. The day they stopped betting against it. On March 7, 1918, a windstorm with gusts exceeding 70 miles per hour struck Manhattan, and every eye turned toward the Flatiron. The storm arrived mid-morning, unexpected and violent. Weather forecasting in 1918 was primitive, limited to barometric pressure readings and coastal observations. No one predicted the system that swept up the Atlantic coast and slammed into New York with tropical storm intensity. By 10 a.m., winds were toppling street signs and shattering storefront windows. By noon, the city had effectively shut down. The Flatiron stood at the convergence of three wind corridors: the Hudson River Channel, the natural north-south flow down Fifth Avenue, and the east-west sweep along 23rd Street. Every previous storm had tested the building. This one would interrogate it. Crowds gathered in doorways and sheltered alcoves, watching the structure sway. And it did sway. My occupants on upper floors reported feeling the building move, a slow rhythmic oscillation that made chairs slide across floors and made stomachs drop. Steel groaned audibly. The facade cracked in 3 places, sending terracotta fragments into the streets below. Police cordoned off the surrounding blocks, expecting collapse. Wind speeds at the Flatiron's base exceeded 100 miles per hour. The updrafts that normally lifted skirts now lifted debris, trash, and loose paving stones. The building had become a vertical tornado, concentrating every gust that struck it and amplifying that force at ground level. Windows on the ground floor shattered inward. The glass awning over the main entrance tore free and tumbled down Fifth Avenue like a metal tumbleweed. Engineers arrived to assess structural integrity. They could not get close enough. The wind made approach impossible. They watched from a block away, taking notes, waiting either for the storm to pass or the building to fall. Both seemed equally possible. The building did not fall. It swayed. It cracked. It lost glass and terracotta and decorative elements. But the steel skeleton, Burnham's 15,000-ton lattice anchored 65 feet into bedrock, held firm. When the storm passed in late afternoon, the Flatiron remained standing while structures around it had sustained catastrophic damage. A 6-story warehouse on 22nd Street partially collapsed. 2 church steeples toppled. Scaffolding on a new construction site 2 blocks away became twisted metal wreckage. The Flatiron suffered only surface damage, cosmetic injuries that could be repaired without touching the structural frame. The next day's newspapers led with the same story. The building everyone predicted would fall had survived the worst storm in New York's recorded history. Engineers who had bet against the structure for 16 years were forced to admit they had been wrong. The Flatiron's design was not just adequate, it was exceptional. Burnham had built something that would outlast doubt, outlast criticism, and outlast the very skeptics who had predicted its doom. The 1918 storm marked the end of structural debate. After that day, no credible engineer questioned whether the building would stand. The question was answered. The proof was absolute. Nature itself had verified what calculations could not convince people to believe. But the storm also created a strange epilogue to the wind tunnel crisis. The sustained hurricane-force winds had demonstrated what the building could do when weather became weapon. For 6 hours on March 7th, no one could walk past the Flatiron safely. The streets were impassable. The wind was genuinely dangerous, not merely humiliating. And in that brief window, the building's daily performance was revealed as a choice. The updrafts that lifted skirts were strong enough to injure, but chose not to. The building could have been dangerous every day. Instead, it was merely degrading. The storm showed the gap between the wind's potential and its typical expression. On March 7th, the Flatiron was a hazard. Every other day, it was just a spectacle. And spectacles, New York had decided, were entertainment rather than assault. The contrast went unexamined in newspapers. Reporters focused on the engineering triumph, the survival story, the vindication of Burnham's vision. The fact that the building had proven itself capable of creating genuinely dangerous conditions was treated as temporary, storm-specific, unrelated to its daily effects. The winds dropped, the repairs began, and within a week, the crowds returned to 23rd Street, waiting for the wind to rise just enough to entertain, but not enough to threaten. The building had passed its final structural test, but it had also demonstrated, in the starkest terms possible, what it had been doing for 16 years, and no one chose to care. The storm marked a turning point, not because it changed the building, but because it ended all structural doubt. After March 1918, the Flatiron's survival was no longer in question. It would stand. The only remaining question was what it would stand for. Chapter 10. When monuments become ordinary. By the 1930s, the Flatiron was no longer controversial, which meant it was no longer particularly profitable either. The building had become background. Tourists still photographed it, but they no longer traveled to New York specifically to see it. The skyline had grown dramatically taller. The Chrysler Building reached 77 stories in 1930. The Empire State Building topped out at 102 stories in 1931. The Flatiron's 22 floors now seemed quaint, a relic of an earlier age when height alone impressed. Commercial tenants sought modern buildings with efficient floor plans, central air conditioning, and elevator systems designed for vertical cities. The Flatiron offered none of these. Its triangular floors created awkward office layouts. Its windows, fixed in place since 1902, could not be replaced without facade demolition. Its mechanical systems were outdated by 3 decades. Vacancy rates climbed through the Depression. By 1935, over 40% of the building sat empty. The Fuller Company had sold the structure in 1925, unwilling to invest in renovations that would never pay returns. The new owners struggled to maintain basic operations. Deferred maintenance accumulated. The building aged ungracefully. Real estate analysts noted that the Flatiron occupied one of Manhattan's most valuable intersections while generating minimal income. The land was worth millions. The structure was worth whatever demolition would cost. Basic economic logic suggested tearing it down and replacing it with something contemporary. But economic logic collided with cultural memory. The building had become a landmark, not in the legal sense, but in the psychological one. It appeared in movies set in New York. It was featured in advertisements for products that wanted to evoke urban sophistication. It had colonized the city's identity so completely that removing it felt like erasing part of New York itself. The Flatiron was no longer just architecture, it was iconography. This created a paradox. The building was too famous to demolish, but not famous enough to sustain itself. It existed in a strange limbo, culturally protected, but financially unsupported. Owners could not tear it down without public outcry. They could not renovate it profitably, so they simply let it deteriorate, slowly, hoping either the market would shift or someone else would inherit the problem. The wind tunnel issue had largely disappeared by the 1940s. Women's fashion had changed. Shorter skirts reduced the wind's visible impact. More importantly, cultural attention had moved elsewhere. The building was no longer novel enough to attract crowds. The daily spectacle simply ended, not through intervention, but through indifference. By 1950, the Flatiron was primarily occupied by magazine publishers and small advertising firms, companies that valued the address more than the space. Having a Flatiron Building office implied you were part of New York's creative economy, even if your actual offices were cramped and outdated. And the building survived on reputation alone. Preservationists began advocating for landmark status in the 1960s, arguing that the Flatiron represented a crucial moment in architectural history when steel frame construction enabled tall, narrow buildings. The argument was technically correct, but emotionally hollow. People did not love the Flatiron because of its structural innovations. They loved it because it looked interesting in photographs. The building received landmark designation in 1966, ensuring it could not be demolished without extensive legal proceedings. The designation did not require maintenance. It simply prevented destruction. The Flatiron was frozen in place, legally protected and physically declining. This was the building's lowest moment. It had survived engineering doubt and critical hatred and natural disasters, but it had not survived obsolescence. The Flatiron stood because it was too famous to fall, not because anyone needed it to stand. It had become a monument to its own past, useful only as symbol. The structure would remain in this state for 2 decades, waiting for someone to decide whether monuments deserved restoration or whether fame alone constituted legacy. Chapter 11. The restoration of what was never quite right. In 1991, workers began a restoration that would cost $40 million to preserve a building once considered unworthy of existing. The project was ambitious and strange. The goal was not to improve the Flatiron, but to return it to its original condition, to make 1902 permanent. Every cracked terracotta panel would be replaced with period-accurate materials. Every window would be restored to its original specifications. The building would be made perfect in exactly the form critics had once condemned. The work took 8 years. Scaffolding covered the facade from 1991 through 1999, turning the landmark invisible while it was remade. Workers fabricated thousands of custom terracotta pieces to match Burnham's original designs. They restored the limestone to its initial honey color. They replaced corroded steel beams without disturbing the overall structural lattice. The project was archaeological, treating a 90-year-old building as though it were ancient. The cost was staggering. $40 million to restore a structure that generated modest rental income. The economics made no sense unless you understood the building's value as symbol rather than asset. The Flatiron was not restored because it was profitable. It was restored because letting it decay felt like cultural failure. The restoration also created an irony that no one openly acknowledged. The building's most controversial feature, the wind tunnel, received no modification. The triangular profile that created 40-mile-per-hour updrafts remained exactly as designed. The architecture that had humiliated women for decades was preserved as historically significant. The restoration treated every element as equally worthy of protection, making no distinction between the building's triumphs and its harms. By 1999, when scaffolding finally came down, the Flatiron looked precisely as it had in 1902. The facade gleamed. The terracotta was pristine. The limestone was smooth and clean. Tourists photographed the restored building, and marveled at its beauty, unaware they were admiring something that had been rebuilt at extraordinary cost to look exactly like something people had once hated. The completed restoration won awards from preservation societies. Architecture journals praised the attention to historical detail. The Flatiron became a case study in how to maintain landmark buildings, an example of restoration done with obsessive accuracy and unlimited budget. But the restored building remained functionally obsolete. The interior spaces were still triangular and awkward. The mechanical systems were updated but constrained by the building's narrow profile. Office tenants still found the floor plans challenging. The restoration had made the building beautiful without making it useful. In 2001, the building was sold again, this time to an Italian real estate investment firm that paid $25 million for a structure that had just absorbed $40 million in restoration costs. The transaction confirmed what preservationists had always understood. The Flatiron's value was not financial, it was cultural. Owning the building meant owning an icon, and icons cannot be valued by conventional metrics. The sale also marked the building's full transition from architecture to artifact. It was no longer a functioning office building that happened to be historic. It was a historic site that happened to contain offices. Tenants were temporary. The landmark was permanent. By the early 21st century, the Flatiron had achieved a kind of immortality. It would never be demolished because its destruction would constitute cultural vandalism. It would never be significantly modified because any change would violate its landmark status. It had become frozen, perfect, and strange, a monument to early 20th century ambition, preserved at early 21st century expense. The restoration had saved the building, but it had also embalmed it, turning something that was once alive and controversial into something preserved and safe. The Flatiron now existed primarily as image, as postcard and photograph and film backdrop. Its physical reality mattered less than its symbolic presence. And in that transformation, the building achieved what it could never accomplish through excellence or innovation. It won by simply refusing to disappear. Chapter 12. The building that won by lasting. Today, the Flatiron stands unchanged at 23rd and 5th, surrounded by a city that finally grew tall enough to meet it. The building is no longer the tallest near Madison Square. It is barely noticeable in a skyline crowded with structures 3 and 4 times its height. But it remains the most recognizable, the single shape that signals New York even when cropped from context. Its triangular profile is shorthand for the city itself, more iconic than taller buildings, more memorable than newer ones. The wind still blows at its base. On gusty days, updrafts still swirl around the northern corner, but no crowds gather. Fashion changed. Culture changed. The phenomenon that defined the building's early decades has been reduced to curiosity, something mentioned in walking tours but no longer experienced as spectacle. The building's most controversial feature has been neutralized by time and indifference. The structure functions now primarily as landmark rather than office building. Tourists photograph it constantly, positioning themselves across the street to capture the full facade or standing at the narrow southern point to emphasize its wedge shape. The images proliferate on social media, each one repeating what Edward Steichen discovered in 1904. The building photographs better than it lives. What the Flatiron represents has shifted across its lifetime. In 1902, it represented audacity, the willingness to build what others called impossible. In the 1910s, it represented controversy, architecture creating unintended social consequences. In the 1930s, it represented obsolescence, ambition outlasting usefulness. By the 21st century, it represents persistence, the simple fact of still standing when so much else has vanished. The building never achieved perfection. Its floor plans remain awkward. Its proportions still violate classical ideals. Its history includes a decade of public humiliation that no amount of restoration can erase. But perfection was never the goal. The goal was to stand. And the Flatiron has stood for over 120 years, through doubt and criticism and storms and economic collapse and shifting aesthetic values. That longevity becomes its own argument. When a building survives this long, its survival proves something. Not that it was right, not that it was beautiful, not that it was harmless, but that it was strong enough and strange enough and visible enough to become unkillable. The Flatiron won not by being the best building, but by being the most impossible to forget. The architects and developers who created it are long dead. Harry Black died in 1931, his fortune lost in the Depression. Daniel Burnham died in 1912, before the building's true legacy emerged. The Fuller Company no longer exists. The crowds who gathered at 23rd Street are gone. The women whose humiliation fueled those crowds are gone. Everyone who experienced the building's first decades has vanished, leaving only the structure itself as witness. And that structure tells a complicated story. It speaks of ambition and consequence, of engineering triumph and social failure, of becoming iconic without becoming innocent. Yet the Flatiron is not a redemption narrative. It is a survival narrative. And survival does not require virtue. It only requires refusing to fall. The building's current owners continue maintaining it at enormous cost, replacing terracotta panels as they crack, repairing limestone as it weathers, updating mechanical systems while preserving historical character. The work is endless and expensive and necessary because letting the Flatiron decay would constitute a kind of cultural betrayal. The building has earned protection not through excellence, but through persistence. Perhaps that is what icons are, structures that survive long enough to outlast their own controversies, that become so embedded in collective memory that removing them feels like amputation. The Flatiron is not Manhattan's best building. It is simply one of Manhattan's most undeniable buildings. And undeniability, it turns out, is a form of power. On any given afternoon, you can stand at 23rd and 5th and watch hundreds of people photograph the building from dozens of angles. They frame it against sky, against surrounding structures, against their own faces. They capture it at every hour, in every season, under every lighting condition. The images pour into the global visual archive, ensuring the building's immortality even if its physical form someday fails. The Flatiron has become larger than itself. It exists now as idea more than object, symbol more than structure. And that transformation, accidental and inevitable, represents the building's final victory. It set out to solve an impossible engineering problem. It succeeded. But in doing so, it created impossible social problems and aesthetic controversies that its creators never resolved. Those contradictions never disappeared. They simply became part of the building's identity, woven into its reputation, inseparable from its fame. The Flatiron is simultaneously beautiful and troubling, innovative and harmful, iconic and complicated. These tensions do not resolve. They coexist, defining a structure that refuses simplification. And so the building stands, wedge-shaped and strange, at the intersection where Broadway cuts through Manhattan's grid. It has outlasted every prediction of collapse, every call for demolition, every shift in architectural fashion. It has survived because survival is what it does best. Not through compromise, not through perfection, but through the simple, stubborn fact of being too visible, too memorable, too embedded in the city's identity to ever truly remove. The Flatiron Building won by lasting, and that, in the end, may be the only victory that truly matters.